Hey everyone, welcome to Base 10 Montessori. My name is Teresa, and today I am going to start on a language series. And what I'm doing in this language series is I'm taking all my different backgrounds from early childhood, AMI Montessori, Orton Gillingham, and also including the research that I did in grad school on language development and dyslexia and all of that. I'm going to put it all together in one video, and actually 4 videos, but I'll explain that in a second. I'm going to put all that information together and try to make this really holistic, comprehensive video about language development and what it looks like from different perspectives. So that is what this series is going to be all about. Now, it's very theory-based. It's heavy on the development. I will be making videos that actually show real activities, the real lessons, especially the ones in Montessori. But this video is really going to be about the theory. This video is actually going to come in 4 different parts because as I started putting all that information together, it kind of grew into this massively huge monster of a video, and I thought I can't put all that out at once. I'll be lucky if people listen to a short video on language development, let alone a really long one. So I broke it into 4 parts, and today we're just going to go over how language develops, and that's going to include the Centers for Language Development, the ages and stages of language development, and of course, because I am a Montessori teacher, I am going to include Montessori's approach to language. So that's today's topic. And then my next video, part 2, will be all about the research I did in grad school and some of the research I've done since grad school. And I think that's going to be really interesting because I start talking about the key predictors for success, particularly for that 0 to 6 age group. So I have a lot of helpful information in part 2, and we'll get there. And then part 3, I'm going to talk more about the activities that support key predictors. Now I'm going to talk about those activities. I'm going to give you information about it. However, the actual videos where I demonstrate those lessons, those will come in different videos. Like I said, this series is going to be all about the theory. And then in part 4, I'm going to talk about how to support all the different deficits you might be seeing in your classroom and how to support families, just some tips on how to include families a little bit more in your language area. And then, of course, I want to make sure and make all my sources available to you, so I'm going to put those in the description down below. Like I said, I'm going to include all the sources, so any links that I have available, I'm going to put them down in the description below. And sometimes I create PDF files, I create different things that you can download, but when I do that, I'm not going to post it here on YouTube. It's going to be at my montessoriforeveryone.locals.com account, and that is a free, it's free to subscribe. So if you create a Locals account and you subscribe to that channel, to my channel right there, I do not have a fee for you to subscribe. Some people on Locals, a lot of people on Locals have a fee. I do not. So that isn't something you have to worry about. So if you see that there is a PDF that I created that you really want, head over to Locals, montessoriforeveryone.locals.com, and you will be able to download that PDF. And today, like I said, we're just going to cover part 1, how language develops. And the reason why I'm talking a lot about theory is because I am a really big believer in the theory. I am a really big believer in knowing why you're doing something. And you can also have a better idea of how to implement it in your particular environment or circumstance. So the theory really allows us to be a little more creative and more flexible with what we're doing. I have discovered that as soon as you understand the purpose and the theory behind it, you actually are more flexible because you can understand when a child is using it purposefully if you understand that theory. And that's what I want to do right here, is help you understand the theory so that you can also use this and understand what is purposeful about what lessons you're presenting with a child. So right now we're going to start with the centers involved for the acquisition of language. So there are 2 centers involved with acquiring language, and that is hearing and speech. That's pretty easy to remember, right? It makes sense. But let's talk about why that is. So the auditory center develops first. So hearing. The child is hearing, right? And this is logical because the child must naturally hear the sounds in use among his own people before he can repeat them. This is something that Maria Montessori said in her book. So this is something that she really emphasizes, is that hearing that sound, the environment has to come first. And then she says after the auditory system, the organs involved with speech develop, and that's the nose, mouth, and throat. So those need time to develop after birth, right? In the meantime, the auditory system is working. The child is born, the auditory system is working most of the time, right? And of course, sometimes it takes some time to discover when it's not, but for the most part, it does work after birth. And so the child's absorbing all these sounds as soon as they're born. But those organs involved with speech, they haven't developed yet. The nose, mouth, and throat, they all need to develop. They need time to develop. And so this is why speech is closely related to the auditory center. And again, to quote Montessori, because the movements for reproducing the words must be based on a substratum of sounds registered in the mind, because the movements he will make depend on the sounds he has heard and which the mind has retained. And then there are two stages of development. There is a pre-linguistic stage and, of course, the linguistic stage. And so the first year of life is that pre-linguistic stage, right? The child isn't really talking. They're not using the words yet. They're playing with the sound, right? They're exercising the throat, the nose, the mouth. All of those things are being manipulated, and the child is spending that first year of life listening. At 12 months, and usually around 12 months, right? The first words are spoken, and this is the linguistic stage. The child has spent about a year of his life listening to the language around him, allowing his speech organs to develop. The first year of life is an intense inner process of hearing language and experimenting with the organs of speech before meaningful speech is produced by the child. And Dr. Montessori once wrote, "A continuous inner growth is taking place, which suddenly appears in a series of discoveries leading to rapid change. Then there follows another period of calm and slow development before the next vigorous outburst." Now, if that sounds familiar, that's because it is from Chapter 10 of the Absorbent Mind. And if you've been following with my Absorbent Mind series, I just released Chapter 10, and that quote was in there. So that is a quote from Chapter 10, Some Thoughts on Language from the Absorbent Mind. This continuous inner growth is taking place during those first 12 months. So the child is spending all that time listening, and then all of a sudden this explosion happens at 12 months, right? And then it might slow down a little bit. She says, don't be surprised if it slows down a little bit. And then there's another outburst of progress. When it comes to the development of language, let's focus on different stages. And the first one, we're going to talk about utero to birth. So when the child is in the womb, the child begins his absorption of his environment before he is even born. Language begins in utero. When the child is born, the infant is attracted to the sound of human voices, particularly the mother's voice. And this, again, is something that we talk a lot about in the Absorbent Mind, when the child is attracted to the human voices instead of, let's say, the dog's voice or the cat's voice. And while, yes, young children do like to make barking sounds and meowing sounds, that's not the language they speak, right? They're going to speak the language of humans and not the language of a dog. And so children are naturally attracted to the sound of human voices. And then after being born, sudden noises trigger the infant, and the child will demonstrate his experience of the noise with a startling reflex or Moro reflex, right? If you've taken classes in early childhood education, you know that Moro reflex, that startling reflex, happens if a loud noise takes place and the child startles, right? So the infant will continue to absorb all those sounds of his environment, but his speech organs will be relatively limited to crying. And if you are a new parent, you're experiencing this quite a bit right now, right? They're not using words. And if it's in the first few months, they're not even really using babbling or cooing at this point. They're really just going to be using crying a lot. That's going to be the sound that they're making. And the physical development of the child still needs time to progress before he can acknowledge a sound beyond a reflex. So those first few months are going to be all about a reflex. And when they do communicate, most likely they're going to communicate through crying when it comes to what sounds they're making. So 0 to 4 months, a lot of things happen as far as language development. The physical development of the child during the first year demonstrates an incredible progression in the development of language. The visual center aids in the production of language during the first year because the infant spends time staring at the face of an adult. And this is why the visual center is extremely important for learning language. And think about that for a second. What has been happening the last couple of years in child care centers and being out and about in public? What has been happening to the mouth area? We've been covering it up. And so when we're talking about language development and we're talking about the benefit or the cost of wearing a mask, I want you to think about that visual center and how that helps develop language, because the child really does spend a lot of time looking at the mouth of an adult. So we have to keep that in mind with language development. So adults often observe that an infant will mimic the adult's position of the mouth and tongue. This happens around 4 months old, right? So they're going to start, after doing all that watching, they've been watching you for about 4 months, then they're going to start mimicking you. They're going to start making those shapes with their mouth. And this is always a really fun time because you make one face and the child will make a face, and it becomes this really fun game. And the infant's ability to observe and process the movements of the mouth motivate him to experiment with his own speech organs. Remember, the child needs to use those organs. He needs to use those organs to complete them. And we talked about that in the Absorbent Mind series, that the organs are not finished when they begin use, but through use, they become completed. So they have to be used in order to be completed, for their development to be completed. If they're not used, then they are not complete. They might be there, but they're not complete. So during this time, the child is busy working the muscles in the face and throat. That will allow him to achieve expression through sound and speech. He is also experimenting with the social aspects of communication, such as smiling. And it's about in that time when the child shows the first real smile, right? Around that 4-month period, you really start to see that genuine smile of happiness right there. So all of these things are part of language development. The social communication, the development of the speech organs, and also the auditory and visual centers are all combined to create language. And then we get into the 6 to 12-month-old, and the child starts making these random syllables and repeats those syllables, right? They're the babbling and the cooing. Around 6 months, the infant starts to babble. He usually is introduced to solid food at this time as well, which works the muscles related to the speech organs in new ways. So I don't know if you've thought about that language development in terms of when the child starts eating solid foods, but there seems to be a correspondence here between those babbling sounds and those first bites of solid food. And all of that is working the organs, the speech organs, and developing those muscles. So all of that works together. At 8 months, the child concentrates on the words around him with interest and can express himself vocally through sounds, but not yet through words. In the next 2 months, the child demonstrates his receptive language skills by acknowledging what is said to him. Receptive language skills, let me point that out real quick. Receptive language skills is understanding what's said to them. And there can be disabilities that affect receptive and not expressive language skills. So I want you to keep that in mind if you're looking at what the child is experiencing. So if they're having trouble acknowledging what's being said, but they can express, that's the different side of the coin than being able to understand but not express. And so those are two different ways that you can observe their language development, is receptive and expressive language skills. So the child can respond through vocal expressions or through pointing his fingers. And those are expressive language skills. And again, you can have a disability on either the receptive or the expressive part of language. So those are both things that we have to look at in terms of development, or if something is developing abnormally. Those are two different areas that we can look at. And then in 12 to 24 months, the child says his first intentional word or a close rendition of the word, maybe some baby talk. I think my parents told me that one of my first words was water, but I didn't say water. I think I said wordy. When we're that age, we don't always get it perfect, right? But the intent is there, and even if they don't say it quite right, you know exactly what they're talking about. And then words are limited to mostly nouns and some simple verbs, but over the following months, the child's vocabulary expands quickly by mimicking and repeating the words he hears most in his environment. So when we talk about this, when the child is at this age learning words, it's going to be nouns. It's going to be a lot of couch, dog, cat, mom, dad, water, milk, bottle, right? All of those things, all those nouns. So don't expect them to have a lot of verbs or anything like that. Really expect those nouns, because at that point in time, the child has the question, that unconscious question of what is this? They're trying to label their environment. And that's something I want you to keep in mind during the 12 to 24 month period, is that we're labeling things. We're labeling the environment. So if you're sitting at home and you have an infant at home or a child that's in the 12 to 24 month old bracket, work on labeling the environment. The child wants to know, what is this? So that's an activity you can do around your house for this age group. And then 12 to 24 months, the child progresses into phrases without grammar, right? This isn't about grammar at this point in time. They're very rough phrases, but then he progresses into phrases with grammar. So he's going to start using those verbs, prepositions, and adjectives pretty quickly. It's amazing how fast this happens, but don't expect it at first. At first, they're going to use just phrases without grammar. It's going to be incomplete. Then all of a sudden, you're going to wake up one day and they've got verbs and prepositions and adjectives, and it's amazing. The development really comes in these leaps and bounds. And then, just like Maria Montessori said in chapter 10, it doesn't all happen at once, though. It's not a consistent progression of development. The child's going to do a lot of inner work, and then it's going to explode, and then it might pull back a little bit. The child does a lot more inner work, and suddenly they have phrases, and then they do some more inner work, and suddenly they have phrases with grammar. So it's going to come out in these explosions of language. And so this is really when the development of language begins to accelerate. And then there's the 2-year-old, 2+ years old. At this point, the child can use every part of speech, speak in sentences, and express his thoughts. As an adult, if you work on a language for 2 years straight, would you be as proficient as a 2-year-old would be in learning English or learning the language of their mother tongue? No. So what they've done is a remarkable thing. And Maria Montessori says, these explosive happenings and eruptions in his powers of expression continue in the child well after the age of 2. So by 2, they're proficient, but they're not done yet, right? They're going to learn a lot more in the next 4 years. So the child is absorbing language without effort during this time. Interest in language will continue to intensify over the next few years because it is a sensitive period for a child in the first plane of development. And look at that, I left off the word plane of development. So that's supposed to say it is a sensitive period for a child in the first plane of development. And the first plane of development is the ages 0 to 6. So that's the first plane in context of Montessori. So Maria Montessori divided the planes of development into every 6 years. So that sensitive period is that window of opportunity where the child is ready to absorb something unconsciously or possibly consciously if it's in the 3 to 6 age group, but they have an easy time of acquiring it. They have an absorbent mind where they can just absorb this. And once that window of opportunity to learn this through absorption, once it closes, it doesn't come again. So if the child doesn't learn it in this point in time between those 0 to 6 age group, they're going to have to work at it later on. It doesn't mean they can't learn, but after the age of 6, it's going to require a lot more effort. And Montessori said the development of speech takes place between the ages of 2 and 5, the age of perceptions, in which the attention of a child is spontaneously turned towards external objects, and his memory is particularly tenacious. So language in the children's house. Let's talk a little bit more about Montessori. In Montessori, the 3 to 6 age group is called the children's house. It's also called the primary environment. So if you're looking at Montessori, we use these terms interchangeably. Children's house, primary age group is the 3 to 6 age group. And in this age group, the child's language is conscious, but he is still absorbing language effortlessly. So in the 0 to 3 age group, the child is really absorbing all this unconsciously. It's not a conscious time of development. So he's just absorbing it passively, a lot more passively in the 0 to 3 age group. But at 3, something happens. He becomes a little more conscious. And I always say that you can tell when this happens if you think back on your own life and you think about the first memory you had. It's going to be around the time of 3. That's when that conscious mind begins. Although I have to say I was watching an episode of Monk the other day where he remembered his own birth. So some of you might have extraordinary memories and remember further back than me, but around the age of 3 is when we start having those memories solidified and we can remember back to around that age. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about how the child is becoming conscious of what they're learning. So at this point in time, at the age of 3, between the ages of 3 to 6, the child's language is really conscious. He's conscious of what he's doing. He's consciously learning, but he's also still absorbing naturally. He's not having to put a whole lot of effort into learning this. And then the development of speech may slow during this time, but the explosion into reading and writing will appear during the child's time in primary. And that's the children's house, that 3 to 6 age group. In fact, there will be a second sensitive period for language during this time, and language is one of those sensitive periods that can tip over a bit into the second plane of development. So it's possible that the child might even be a little older than 6 and still be in that sensitive period. So I don't want you to say, oh, the child's 6 now, they're totally done being absorbent. Nature doesn't work like that, right? We're all just a little bit different. But this is a general guide, right? This is about generally how it works. So E.M. Standing said that it is now the construction of language, the construction, I want to emphasize the word construction here, it is now the construction of language which fascinates the child. And his interest now becomes focused on the relationship between words. So remember how I said that child around the ages of 12 to 24 months, they want to know all about all these nouns. What is this? Their question is, what's this? What's that, right? You want to label everything. Well, as they get towards the end of that second plane, or towards the end of that first plane of development, their interest changes to figuring out the relationship between words. And we give the child language at that point in time to help him reorganize and classify his experiences with the world. Labels, phrases, sentences in a variety of formats. So in the first 3 years of life, the child is absorbing the language, right? Just taking it all in passively, unconsciously. And so what happens in that 0 to 3 age group is a period of creation. The child is creating his speech organs, they're creating the construct for language, and they're absorbing it. And then when they get to be into that 3 to 6 age group, something different happens. They're consolidating all that they have created. And now they have all this information. They've absorbed all this information those first 3 years, and now they have to organize that information. They have to classify that information. And that's what we're doing in that 3 to 6 environment, is helping them organize the information and classify that information. So the child knows what to do with it. Where in his brain does he store this information, and how does it relate to other information? That's what's going on when it starts to switch from the first sensitive period for language and goes into that second sensitive period for language. The child has a desire to understand and ask the question, what? Or what is this? In response to the world around him. Now, in the second plane, those questions start to change. In the second plane, those questions change into possibly why or how. But in the first plane, we're really talking about what. What is this? How do I organize this information, and how do I classify it? So that's what we're really talking about in this age group. Now in Montessori, we teach 9 different types of presentations. So we're going to offer all these presentations in the language area. And the first one is spoken language, and this is something we really work on when the child first enters the classroom, and we do this through conversations and storytelling and just maybe even some observations, right? So this is really an informal thing that we do. And then we have enrichment of vocabulary, which can be formal and informal lessons. We might go through some classified cards on, let's say, tools, and we might show the child a hammer. And if they don't know what a hammer is, we'll give them the language for hammer. So we'll give them all sorts of pictures and we'll associate language with them, and we'll also try to organize them and classify them as we go. Like, these are land animals, these are water animals, these are animals that go up in the air. These are transportation devices. These are transportation devices in a city. These are transportation devices that you might see on a farm, right? And we'll start offering language and organizing and classifying the language. And then we get into writing. In writing, we're going to be expressing ourselves. And so we're not trying to figure out what someone else is saying. We're trying to express what's going on inside of us. So just like hearing comes before the speech, writing comes before reading, because writing is all about expressing what is inside of your mind, what's inside of yourself, while reading is trying to figure out what someone else is saying. And so just like hearing and speech have an order, writing and reading have an order. And writing, we call it encoding because we're expressing it, right? We're coding it. And then reading is called decoding because we're trying to decode what other people are saying. And when we come to writing and reading, it really should be writing that we're teaching first. However, I will say that I have had some students that naturally read before they could write. This is particularly the case with some of my students who have had autism. And for some reason, they could easily decode, but they could not encode. And so I find this to be a really interesting observation that I don't have a lot of information on and I don't have research on. So if you have more information about that, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that below, because I have noticed there are times when a child flips that order. But for the most part, it is writing before reading. And then we do word study, and word study is like the synonyms and homonyms and antonyms and compound words, right? All of those different types of ways we put words together and classify words. Function of words is where we're really teaching. In Montessori, we don't say we teach grammar. In the 3 to 6 age group, we teach the sensorial impression of grammar. And if you don't understand what that means just yet, don't worry. That is something I am going to cover later on, and I will give demonstrations for later on. So if that doesn't make sense, don't worry. We'll get there. And then we'll do reading analysis. So my 5 and 6-year-olds have sentences that I'll write out for them, and they will break it apart. They'll break it apart into the subject, the verb, the object. We'll do some prepositional phrases, and so they'll cut it apart and then we'll transpose it and put it back together and we'll symbolize it. So we do grammar and we do reading analysis with our kindergartners, and then we do interpretive reading. And interpretive reading is really where we want to go with a child. Interpretive reading means I can not only decode what somebody is saying, I can understand it, I can process it, I can even interpret it and express how I feel about it when I read it back. So that's kind of where we're going when we're learning all these different things in the Montessori environment. And then, of course, in the Montessori environment, we also have language extensions. And I can get into more into that later, but I don't want to take up a ton of time going over what the language extensions are. But they can also just be different ways we provide different experiences for the same activity. So you'll see a bunch of extensions in AMI Montessori, and I'll get deeper into that in a different video. So what is the purpose of the language area in Montessori? What we're going for here are 3 things. The first one is self-expression. This begins with spoken language, with conversation and storytelling, right? We want the child to express himself. And this is really important because if you are looking in the toddler environment, and sometimes we get a biter in the toddler environment, right? And a lot of toddler teachers say, well, As soon as they get more language and they can express themselves, we're going to see that biting stop, because biting is usually a way for the child to do something that they feel they're empowered to do because they don't have another way of expressing themselves. And so often we say, as we work on our language, if we work on identifying, oh, I see that you are really angry, or I see you really wanted that book, and so had that book. Maybe let's ask for it and say, may I have that book, please, right? And so we really spend a lot of time with this self-expression, this spoken language, and that's really what they're working on a lot in the toddler rooms, is making sure that language starts to happen, because without self-expression, the child really can't communicate their needs. And this becomes very frustrating for the child, and you might see that in different ways. And that could continue into the primary environment if they aren't working at self-expression in the toddler environment. So the next part is enrichment of vocabulary. So the 3 to 6 environment is a fantastic time to introduce as many complicated words as you want. Don't be afraid to use big words. They love it. They absorb it. They can understand it a lot easier than what you may think. And so when we're talking about having conversations with children, and we're talking about what type of language we should be using with children, well, we don't want to have super adult language with children, right? We do actually really want to use a lot of vocabulary and not be afraid of scientific terms and phrases and classifications. When I do, let's say, parts of the horse, we're going to go through all the different parts of the horse. We're going to talk about the eye and the mane and the tail and the hooves. And when you get to parts of a fish, there's lots of complicated words that go with the parts of a fish, right? We have like the dorsal fin. And so we're using all this language with children at this age, and we need to be using language at this age because this is the time that they can absorb it. It's not going to take that much effort for them to learn. Now, if they have a disability, we're going to have to do some extra work to help them acquire vocabulary, but that 0 to 6 environment is where we are all about learning the language. And we can do this formally through a 3-period lesson, but we can also do this informally through conversation, where they can just absorb and experience the language around them. And this is also why, if you have a lot of conversations at home, and let's say you're a doctor and you use a lot of medical words at home, the child is going to pick up on those medical words. It's going to be something they absorb. Same thing if you work construction. If you work construction and you're using all sorts of tools and you're talking about all sorts of different ways to build something, or if you're an engineer and you're talking about all these different scientific ideas that you're putting into your engineering work, a child that is around that on a regular basis is going to absorb that. And so just keep that in mind with your conversations. We don't need to use baby talk. We can use our normal conversations, and sometimes you might have to break it down into smaller words, right? But for the most part, the child is going to absorb it. So if you really want them learning that type of vocabulary, just make sure you also associate it with objects or pictures. In the primary environment, we use objects. So when I say something, I associate it with an object that I can put in my hand. And it's usually something I can manipulate, something the child can pick up, but sometimes it's bigger than that, right? And if it is bigger than that, or if it's something outside of my environment, I use pictures. And we do this in the Montessori environment through something called classified cards. They're also known as 3-part cards. So those are the different ways to associate words with what's going on in the environment. But like I said, anytime you go outside of your current environment, we use pictures. And then, of course, we do what the purpose of language in Montessori is writing and reading, right? That's where we're going. But in order to write and read, they really need to have exposure to that vocabulary first. So hearing, again, it all goes all the way back to that beginning of hearing the sounds, of hearing the conversations, then working on the speech organs, and then mimicking. And then when we have fully experienced that, we start doing that sound symbol relationship with letters, that symbolization process with letters through writing. And then once they become familiar with those letters through writing, we work on reading. So that is a little bit of the process. Now let's talk about some basic materials that we use in the Montessori environment. And when it comes to the development of writing, which remember I said, just like hearing, it comes first. And the writing is always in cursive when it comes to AMI Montessori. And we do this with even our 3 to 4-year-olds. We do sandpaper letters and we use them. We use the cursive sandpaper letters. And the child hears and experiences the sound symbol relationship through the sandpaper letters. And then we move on to the movable alphabet. And in the movable alphabet, there are wooden letters in a big box. So there's all the letters are in there and the consonants are pink and the vowels are blue. Sometimes it gets switched though, so depending on who you buy it from. It's not always the case. And we have those in cursive and the child builds words through those wooden letters. And then the child starts working on the chalkboard. And if you want to know why, I have my, I'll have some more video. I have some videos out. The one I did on multisensory education, my Montessori Live video on multisensory education talks a lot about that chalkboard use and why we use chalkboard. So that's a good one to watch if you're wondering why we go from movable alphabet to chalkboard to paper. But that is for the development of the hand. And this is, of course, a writing experience because the child is expressing himself. So anytime you're looking at the child, even if they're not holding a pencil or a chalk or anything like that, if they're using symbols to express themselves and letter symbols to express themselves, that's writing. They're encoding words and sentences when they do that. So that is writing. And in order to build up the hand, we consider, the strengthening of the hand is also part of writing. That's part of the development of writing. So don't just think about them learning the letters, but also think about developing the hand for writing. And we do this through not just the chalkboard, but the metal insets. And the metal insets are a wonderful activity that really develop the muscles in the hand, as well as the pincer grip and visual tracking. When I talk about visual tracking, that is, can the eye follow where the hand is going? Can the eyes look while the hand is following a certain line? So that's a really important skill to have when learning how to write. And then we move on to the development of reading. And when we read, we always read in print. And in the Montessori environment, this happens around the age of 4 and, 4 and up, really. And so when we talk about the development of reading in the Montessori environment, it starts with object box 1. And so we have these objects in a box and we want to label them. So there are objects I can hold in my hand and it'll be simple, short phonetic words associated with the object. So I'll write on a label, let's say bat. And I'll write it out and the child has to sound out b-at. So whatever you put in object box 1, make sure that those are the symbols that they know the sounds for when they get there. But it's very simple objects with very simple words that they have to read and associate. And that's really where they start reading it. They started putting all those letters together and blending them. And when they get better at that, that's when we start object box 2. And those are objects which will have labels that have phonograms in them. So we're going to start introducing the syllable rules, like consonant digraphs, right? We're going to talk about bossy R's, vowel teams, all that different type of stuff. So that's usually probably around 4.5 to 5 years old when we start doing some phonograms. And then, of course, with reading, there's always books and lists and labels and classified cards, or 3-part cards, as some people might call them. So that's writing and reading, but there's also 2 more areas that we really talk about in terms of the Montessori environment. We also need to talk about spelling. This is a question I get a lot from parents. Well, how do you teach them how to spell, right? Because we talk a lot in Montessori about not correcting the child when they make a mistake. We don't correct them. If they're spelling words with the movable alphabet, if they're writing words on paper, we don't correct them. So if we don't correct them, how do we teach spelling? And one of the ways we start doing that is through the small movable alphabet. And so the child will have let's say a card with a list of words on it. And the child will have 2 small movable alphabets, and these will be in print. They're not in cursive because this is all about reading. And so you'll have a black movable alphabet and a red movable alphabet, both in print. And so you're going to write, let's say, a phonogram in red. Let's say a consonant digraph. Let's say CH, you write with the red letters. And then the rest of the letters, more the phonetic letters, you'd write in black. And so what the child does is they go through that list of words and they'll read it and they'll read through it, and then they're going to turn the card over, and then they're going to spell as many of the words as they can remember from that card. And when they've done that, they turn the card back over, they check their work, and they check to see if they made a mistake in the spelling, and if they did, they fix it, and then they continue on if they would like. So we start introducing the idea of spelling by allowing the child to have a control of error, where they can check their own work against that control of error. So that is not up to the adult to tell them if they've got it right or wrong, but it is up to the child to check their own work and have an interest in their own work and an interest in perfecting themselves. And then they have an interest in their own perfection rather than someone coming along and telling them they got it wrong. So that is how we approach spelling. And we can also do this with the classified cards, the 3-part cards. The children can start looking at those cards, and we can play games with turning the control cards over and trying to match the words there, or writing the words from the classified cards. So those are a couple different ways how we begin that spelling portion. And again, we do this around the age of 5 years old in the Montessori classroom. And in kindergarten, my third years, do start getting that sensorial impression of grammar. And we read in print, we write in cursive. So if the child reads in print, they will write in cursive, with the exception being that small movable alphabet. We do use the print small movable alphabet. And so when we talk about a sensorial impression of grammar, really what we want to do is give the child a very concrete impression of what something is, an experience of what the grammar concept is. And so when we're talking about grammar in the Montessori environment, in that third year group for the 3 to 6 age group, those 6-year-olds, we're talking about the noun, article, adjective, conjunction, preposition, verb, adverb. And then we do some simple sentence analysis, which might include prepositional phrases depending on how far the child gets along in the lessons. And so when we talk about, let's say, the adjective, we talk about the adjective in a way where the child becomes a detective. Like, this is one of our games, the detective adjective. And so when I'm talking about a sensorial impression of grammar, and I'm talking about the child experiencing the grammar concept, I'll set up, let's say, all these farm animals. And let's say I have 5 different types of cows over in the farm. And I'll write on a piece of paper, the cow. And so the child will go over and bring me a cow. I'm like, oh, this is a cow, but it's not the cow I'm thinking of. I'm going to have to give you a clue. And I might write the sitting cow, or the spotted cow, or the standing cow, or the eating cow, right? Something that gives a clue. And I might have to give 3 or 4 clues before the child figures out which cow I'm thinking of. And so when we're talking about doing a sensorial impression of grammar, we're really talking about making sure the child experiences the concept in a very physical, concrete way. And so we don't really use the terms noun, article, adjective, conjunction, and all of that in the kindergarten environment. However, we do use it directly when they go into elementary, into the second plane of development. But I try to stay away from that quite a bit when we're in the primary environment and just give them that impression. And then they go on to label it later on in the elementary group. And of course, because language doesn't just stay in the language area, it flows over into other areas, every area. We have to also talk about the math area, the sensorial area, and the practical life area. So language in all the other areas is only given after the child has experienced the qualities of the materials in a concrete way. So that means that whatever lesson I'm giving in a different area, most likely I'm not going to give a lot of language for it until the child has worked with it, until they've had experience with it. The child needs to build those neural pathways of the concrete experience before you introduce the language. So this is presented in a particular sequence. The child will become comfortable with the material before language is introduced in association with the material. And then the most likely method of introducing language will come in the form of a formal 3-period lesson, but sometimes it can come informally through absorption from just talking about it. If you're interested in the 3-period lesson, I'm not going to go through it now, but I do have a video all about the 3-period lesson on my YouTube channel. So feel free to look for that. It's going to be Montessori Deep Dive, the 3-period lesson. You can look for that. I explain the 3-period lesson in detail on that video. So the child learns words that express, describe, and classify knowledge and experiences. And then he learns the function of words and how to analyze sentences. And then, of course, at the end of all that, the child can understand a proper sequence of words. So this is something that we work through in all the different areas and we put together, and then it comes to fruition in those more advanced language lessons. So that is the beginning of my language development series for right now. And part 2 will come up very soon, but I hope you liked part 1. If you have, go ahead and give a thumbs up to this video, like, share, comment, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.